Grant ended up as a full-on critic of the Laurentian elite that he had been born into. He argued that elite of the early and mid-20th century had actually forgotten Canada's distinctive roots. The government has to come in and, in Rousseau's language, force you to be free, force the rest of us to endorse what you have seen in being authentic to yourself. But if I don't want to enforce that, well, then I need to be re-educated. I think he would tell Justin Trudeau that the emphasis on post-colonialism, the emphasis on, at best, soft-pedaling our history and at worst overthrowing our history, in fact, ends up undermining our entire identity and makes us ripe for the picking.
Concepts with Shawn Whatley.
In this episode, we start out by looking at George Grant, the famous Canadian philosopher and author of Lament for a Nation. Grant has admirers on both the left and the right. In fact, Grant's Lament for a Nation sparked the rise of the New Left in Canada, which is very unusual for an old-style conservative. I asked Professor Geddert what Grant might say to us today. What would he think of Justin Trudeau and the last decade of denigrating Canada as racist, colonialist, and even genocidal? We get into some pretty niche but I think essential philosophy when we talk about left versus right Hegelianism. Don't panic, I'm no expert on Hegel. Thankfully, Jeremy is able to show how Hegel's thought explains much about both the left and the right in Canada today. Thanks so much for watching, and please subscribe, like, and share a comment. I hope you enjoy this episode. Jeremy Geddert is an associate professor of political science at Assumption College. He is an author, a speaker, and most recently a sought-after expert on George Grant. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks, Shawn. I'm delighted to be here.
Great. So who is or who was George Grant?
So George Grant has been described as Canada's most famous, maybe most idiosyncratic, most characteristic political thinker. So George Grant was born into a very famous Canadian family. His grandfather was the principal of Queen's University. His father was the headmaster of Upper Canada College. So very much born into what we might today call the Laurentian elite. But Grant ended up as a full-on critic of the Laurentian elite that he had been born into. He argued that elite of the early and mid-20th century had actually forgotten Canada's distinctive roots, that its concept of Britishness was progressive, and in that sense, it was actually overthrowing the British inheritance. Because of this, Grant argued Canada was becoming increasingly enamored of the United States and enamored of modernity and of technology. This, he argued, threatened Canada's existence as a nation, something that was captured in his famous 1965 Lament for a Nation, which catapulted him to public prominence in a way that most university professors do not have. And so that's probably the book that your average Canadian knows him from.
Brilliant. So great answer. Why are people so excited about George Grant right now? What would he say to Canada at this moment?
Well, I think George Grant is amazingly timely today because the message that he gave in 1965, the subtitle of the book was The Defeat of Canadian Nationalism, seemed to be obviously wrong. After all, Canada has existed as a sovereign nation for a good while since. It has not been taken over by the United States. In fact, Canada has been very prosperous during this time. But I think people have forgotten that Canada's self-understanding can face a threat from the United States. I think Grant would say that this is exactly the problem, that we don't realize that our national self-understanding is under threat from the United States until someone like Donald Trump comes along. I think he would say that because we have been less and less able to articulate in a positive sense what it means to be Canadian, that our sense of Canada seems to be purely negative, that we're simply not American. Well, then when Donald Trump comes along and threatens us, and we need to have some kind of positive identity to stand up against the United States, to make us willing to take on the sacrifices that we're going to have to take on here, we don't know what to say.
Yeah, brilliant. It seems like politicians maintain their position and power by dividing the country. At least that's what's been going on for the last 10 years. What would he say right now to Justin Trudeau about what Canada is?
Well, I think he would say Canada is not a post-national state.
Yeah.
In a sense, I think Trudeau's vision was that Canada is going to lead the world into a bold new era of post-nationalism. But I think Grant would say that any kind of ideology that is hoping to lead the world in some kind of way is not going to be distinctively Canadian. And in fact, is not going to be distinctive to any particular nation if it is something that can be exported around the world. So I think he would tell Justin Trudeau that the emphasis on post-colonialism, the emphasis on, at best, soft peddling our history and at worst overthrowing our history, in fact, ends up undermining our entire identity and makes us ripe for the picking.
Yeah. So what kind of conservative then does that make George Grant? You mentioned Britain, you mentioned the nation. Is there a certain flavor of conservative that he would be?
Well, in a sense, he was idiosyncratic by our contemporary categories. But I think maybe the best way to describe him is as a classical conservative or as a pre-modern conservative. I think Grant really understood the idea of an inheritance, the fact that there is an order that precedes us. Liberalism is going to say that we don't have any obligations beyond those that we have individually chosen. And progressivism is going to say those choices that we make for ourselves, particularly about our identity, needs to be endorsed by the nation. I think Grant would say that to be conservative means to be cognizant of what he would call the eternal things, of things that are lasting. And those things are mediated to us through our particular tradition in the same way that we are born into families. And so we have an inheritance there from our family, both in a good sense that we get great benefits from this, and not simply in a sort of financial kind of sense, but in the sense that we have a family legacy that our parents inculcate in us certain ways of being, but also that we have obligations to that. We don't get to choose our family. We don't go around to, all the different houses on the block and test them out and see, I wonder if this would be a better family for me. Even if they have a house that's 10 times as big as ours and a lot more glitzy and glamorous and plays a lot better on social media, it's not our house. And so I think Grant would be the kind of conservative that emphasizes what is ours, emphasizes loving what is ours. And at the political level, our nation is what he would say is the thing that needs to be conserved the most.
Yeah, it reminds me of Scruton's famous word, oikophilia, love of home. So I want to push back just a tiny bit on the obligations part, because I use exactly the same example that you use about family. I think it's the best one. So not all of the obligations that we have are voluntary. Some of them we get because we're born in a certain family. And so I presented this to one of my libertarian friends who I've had on the podcast. And he said, well, wait a second, Shawn, wait a second. Those are moral obligations. I'm talking about political obligations. All of your political obligations are 100% voluntary, or they're not legitimate. And so he caught me there for a second. And there is some truth to that for sure. But then later I was thinking, well, hang on a second. Isn't political philosophy a branch of moral philosophy? And I thought, I got to ask an actual professor this question later. So what are your thoughts on someone arguing that, well, those obligations to your family, those are moral obligations. They're important, but they're not really political obligations. It's a different category of thing.
Yeah, Shawn, that's a great question, and that's a good argument from someone who is a libertarian, because that follows from a liberal kind of approach that is going to separate out the state from anything higher. So this is helpful as a corrective to progressivism, which would say that politics is endorsing our identity, and that politics, in fact, is the highest thing. This is the kind of thing that we see, for instance, in communism, in the Soviet Union. Marx argues that the utopia is going to be ushered in by the state, by politics. Well, that's a false statement, and libertarians and conservatives can agree that that is a false statement. But I think Grant would say the problem with the libertarian is that they take the critique to extremes. They say that in order to avoid the false progressivist vision of the state, we need to shrink the state altogether. We need to say that the political obligation has nothing to do with the moral obligation. And I think Grant, as a conservative, would say, no, we need to redirect the state toward a kind of true morality. And that kind of true morality recognizes that there is something above the state, that the state, and really I'd prefer to use the language of the nation, that the nation is valuable precisely because it points us beyond the nation, that it points us toward philosophy and theology. So Grant, of course, loved to go back to the ancients, particularly to Plato. But I'm going to draw from Aristotle here, who was Plato's student. Aristotle is going to say that politics is inseparable from moral philosophy, because it's in our national life that we learn to be moral with other people, that we learn to be moral in the public realm, not simply within the confines of blood relations as we have in the family. But Aristotle also recognizes that if the political life is essential, there's also something that is beyond that, and that is for him the philosophic life. And a Christian thinker like, say, Thomas Aquinas is going to build on this by saying that there's a theological life that in addition to the philosophic life, and that the natural realm of the political world, the natural virtues that we develop there, the virtue of justice, which is a good thing, but it's not the highest thing. The virtue of charity is going to be higher than the virtue of justice. And so the things that we practice in the realm of this world, the political life, are going to, in a sense, whet our appetite for something higher, but they're also going to train us to be ready for something higher. So in that sense, there's a relation there between the two, even though they are not the same thing.
Wow, yeah, great answer. All right, so a great answer on the moral obligations. And I wanted to pivot a bit, if that's okay, and ask you about a comment that George Grant made about capitalism. He said, quote, "The directors of General Motors Corporation and the followers of Marcuse sailed down the same river in different boats," end quote. What did he mean by that?
So there are a lot of people who would argue that Grant was not a conservative because Grant frequently criticizes what he calls corporation capitalism. The academic literature on Grant, some think he was a conservative, some actually think he was a socialist. Now, I believe he was a conservative, but I can understand why people might think that given Grant's criticisms. What Grant saw was that if, as the director of a corporation, particularly a large one, if your number one goal is profit, there is no inherent link to the benefit of the nation by pursuing profit. In fact, neoclassical economic theory, talking about the division of labor and the economic efficiencies that come with that, is going to favor free trade. This is, of course, a huge issue throughout most of Canadian history. And a little known fact is that for most of Canadian history, the conservatives, the ones who wanted to defend the nation, were very skeptical about free trade. And it was, in fact, the liberals who wanted free trade. Wilfrid Laurier won 4 consecutive majority terms. Then in 1911, he proposes free trade, and the Canadian people say, no way.
Wow.
Why would they have done that? Well, because they recognize that becoming too dependent on the United States could put us in the exact kind of situation that we find ourselves in today.
Right.
And so Grant argued that corporations are going to go where the profit is.
Right.
Well, if a lot of people, for instance, have a secular religion of wokeness, well, then that's where corporations are going to go. Because it costs them almost nothing to virtue signal to progressivism. It costs them a lot to change their whole business models, which is why, interestingly enough, you get some people, sort of the old school leftists, the Bernie Sanders types, who kind of dislike woke capitalism because they say, oh, this actually is just virtue signaling. But the followers of Marcuse, who were very much about this progressivism, this sort of secular religion, are really, they don't face an enemy in corporation capitalism once they become the majority. And I think we're seeing this today with the advent of deplatforming. This is one of the biggest challenges to conservatives. And I think conservatives around the world are starting to understand that the market does not necessarily work in favor of the nation, and it doesn't necessarily work in favor of conservatism.
Right. Now, that's not to say that he was anti-capitalism. Would you say he was anti-capitalism, or?
I think Grant understood the value of enterprise, and he certainly understood the value of liberty. But Grant was always speaking in relation to the United States because he really viewed the United States as the greatest threat to Canadian identity. This didn't mean that he didn't recognize the grave dangers of communism. And when forced to, he was very clear that communism was a far greater evil than Americanism. But he certainly recognized some of the subtle dangers in unrestrained capitalism. He understood the idea of ordered liberty. And I think he was worried that we were going to lose this sense of order and simply focus on liberty, particularly as the American voice got louder and louder in the Canadian mind.
Interesting. Yeah. So at one point in a lecture that you gave us to a group of us last year, you mentioned that Grant had some insights on a very old idea that politics is. So Howard Laswell in 1936, I had to look this up. He wrote a very famous book called Politics, Who Gets What, When, Where, and How. And that was the title of his book. Whereas you told us that George Grant did not see politics as nothing but who gets what, where, when, and how. I wonder if you could unpack that for us and maybe tell us whether or not people still believe that is true today, that politics is nothing but who gets what, when, where, and how. And how would George Grant see things differently?
Yeah. I think Grant would say that the idea of politics as who gets what, when, where, and how is a purely modern approach to politics.
Mm.
It views politics as mediating this sort of war over resources, a way of kind of moderating the scramble for resources in a way that makes sure that the distribution of resources is fair. So this whole question doesn't really talk about, well, what are we using those resources for? What's the point of it all? What does it mean to be Canadian? We can be a wealthy nation, and in fact, our close economic ties with the United States until very recently have in fact made us more wealthy. But toward what purposes? What is Canada known for in the world? How will we be remembered 200 years from now, or 500 years from now, or 1,000 years from now? If we're prosperous, but we're not distinctive, then we're not going to be remembered. Because if we're simply prosperous, people will say, boy, they sure wasted it on looking like everybody else. They didn't really have a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose. And that's ultimately what defines a nation. What are you doing this for?
Right.
And I'm not sure that we have good answers to that anymore.
Yeah.
That Grant did.
Brilliant. Yeah, great answer. So I'm trying to think of what my so I've called myself a libertarian in the past, and so that those are my roots. Now I'm calling myself a reluctant conservative, or at least I'm realizing that I'm more conservative than perhaps I realized before. So my libertarian instincts would say, oh, hang on a second, Geddert here. Does that mean you have a vision for what's good for me, and you're going to use politics to enforce that vision on me? That's sounding awfully totalitarian and tyrannical of you. So how do we avoid that extreme? If we believe that politics actually has a telos or an end, or we're aiming at something, then how do we avoid the tyrannical side of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was a question that was naturally asked during the Cold War, when we really did face a tyrannical, totalitarian enemy. And it's also a legitimate question to ask today, particularly in Canada, where the levers of the state are being directed, generally speaking, by a sort of progressivist elite that is opposed to the sort of good that Canada would have been aiming at, say, 100 years ago. So I guess my answer would be that the abuse of a thing does not invalidate that thing. That the abuse of the state for the wrong purposes doesn't mean that the state never should be directed toward any kind of purposes. And I think the most central distinguishing characteristic here is that for a conservative, the state plays only a sort of intermediary role, because the state cannot bring you ultimate happiness. And this is what, Marxism states explicitly and progressivism states implicitly. For conservatism, if you are expecting ultimate happiness through the state, if you're expecting ultimate happiness through the state recognizing you, then you're always going to be disappointed. And this is where the danger comes, because when progressivist politics gives this impression that this is where ultimate happiness is to be found, well, you are inevitably going to be disappointed. And so the progressivist is going to say, okay, so now we need to get more heavy-handed as a state. Now we need to get more heavy-handed as a state. We need to take away more and more of your liberties. A conservative is always going to recognize that while politics can point you in the right direction, politics can't ultimately get you there. You know, this is why our Constitution mentions God, because this is actually a limit on politics. The most dangerous regimes in history were the ones that denied any kind of source of transcendent morality beyond them. And that is precisely what I think a conservative vision of the state puts front and center. Now, this is different from saying that the state is going to have specifics about dogma, particularly religious. But I think a conservative is going to say that there is something beyond the state that limits the state. You know, this is why conservatism is a sort of mediation between order and liberty. Both of these always have to be there. Whereas with progressivism, the vision of the state inevitably leads to less and less liberty.
Yeah, great answer. So your comments about even a comment about God in the Constitution reminded me of the difference between rule of law approach versus legal instrumentalism. So the folks who think they can write laws to solve social problems are on the legal positivism or legal instrumentalism side of things, whereas the folks who appeal to a rule of law as an ill-defined but still very real concept that laws must defer to ultimately. So you just can't make up any law you want. Your laws that you write are actually in subordination to the concept of the rule of law. And I see that as a reflection, at least in jurisprudence, to the concept that you just talked about on the Constitution side. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the reasons that the rule of law is so important is because it recognizes the fallibility of human beings.
Yeah.
And that's something that any kind of conservatism that looks to a higher order is going to recognize that there is an order beyond us, an order not of our own making, and an order that we never perfectly live up to. So conservatism is always going to be aware of the fallibility of human beings, and therefore skeptical of any governments that get too powerful.
Yeah, brilliant. And just to build on that too, so I would, and people probably already know this about me, but I would come on the side of theism. But just to be clear, you don't have to be a theist to hold these ideas as we've just discussed. So I think of David Hume and how he is famous for his skepticism. Reason is everywhere and always a slave of the passions. And he said that's why he distrusted these arbitrary attempts to create order or to adjust what we have inherited. He said because he didn't trust human reason. However, because of his deep skepticism about the human reason, he said all we're left with is tradition and custom. And so even if you take a Humean approach, you still end up at the same spot of saying that there's something other than simply, Jeremy and Shawn writing up new laws to fix social problems.
Yeah, you bring up a really fascinating figure. One who I don't completely have my head around, and someone whom I'm interested to read more of, because Hume is an interesting kind of conservative, and he was someone who was cited by conservatives in his own time. And I think Hume does provide a sort of foundation for a non-theistic conservatism. Having said that, I do think there are some real tensions between a kind of Humean conservatism and even, say, a Burkean conservatism. And this is something that I think Grant recognized. He could read someone like David Hume or Walter Bagehot or even John Stuart Mill, Northrop Frye, and say, these people, generally speaking, have good political judgment. They recognize the problems of progressivism. They value tradition. But at the end of the day, they have kind of undercut the foundation for what they want. So, for instance, Bagehot believes that it's important to have a sort of deference to something higher, deference to the monarchy. Grant will say, yeah, that's true. That's a good thing. But if you've lost the sense of the transcendent, then at the end of the day, that's not really going to hold up.
Yeah.
Particularly if your tradition loses its moorings in the eternal order, then you may need to correct your tradition from or by reference to that eternal order. If you don't have that eternal order, well, then your tradition might end up becoming the tradition of Trudeaupian liberalism. You know, I've had progressives make the argument to me, well, hey, you know, this kind of is our new tradition, and so, you know, if you want to be conservative, you want slow change, well, actually, you know, you should be a liberal, you know, because being a conservative is kind of going back. That would actually be bigger change. And I think this is the danger of where Hume can go when he gets separated from that foundational order.
Yeah, great comment. Now, this might be way beyond what our audience on this podcast wants to get into, but you reminded me of an essay I just wrote. You wrote a chapter in that book on Canadian conservative thought, and I'll put a picture of it up on the screen for people. But there's a chapter in there by on Grant, Time, and Being by, I forget the author's name, but he talks about Grant's different philosophies of history. And so you and I are talking more in an Aristotelian or Platonic view of history, where there's actually some interaction between being and time. And now, obviously, Aristotle's view is different than Plato's, but the Nietzschean view is where we are fully immanentizing both being and history. And so really it's all about will and taking charge and changing. And so I think, as you've described, the severance of those roots in tradition, and as you've described it, so the Hume and the Northrop and the John Stuart Mill and the other folks that you listed, it's almost the cut flower syndrome, where they want the product of this line of thinking that started with the foundations that George Grant described and you've just dilated on, but they don't want to deal with those foundations anymore. Well, I think George Grant would say, well, you fully immanentized your view of history and time, and that leads inevitably to a Nietzschean outcome. Now, this might be getting way too weird and way too down a rabbit hole, so feel free to not respond to it if you don't want to, but does that spark any thoughts for you?
Shawn, I think that's a fantastic observation, and yeah, this really gets into complicated questions of nature and history, but I think this is very legitimate. You know, the Canadian way, and sort of as opposed to the American way, from the beginnings, from when the United Empire Loyalists came to Canada in 1783, basically established English Canada, they understood this principle of hierarchy. They were okay with the idea that there might be a discourse out there that is beyond what they can fully grasp. And they're okay with that. And so talking about time, being, and eternity is a legitimate thing in public discourse. And in fact, I've got a piece coming out in the Dorchester Review that's responding to a critique of that very volume, including a critique that I think Colin Cordner's chapter that you responded to is kind of too abstruse and too abstracted from policy.
Really? I love that chapter.
And I think it is relevant to talk about these kinds of things. I certainly don't have a comprehensive answer to your question. The quick answer that I'll try to go with is that one of the things that Christianity gives us is that the source of nature, i.e. God, enters into time. So we come to know nature differently, you know, nature and supernature through time, you know, that we are fundamentally in a different period of history after Christ, which is why the calendar goes back to, you know, the date that was thought to be Christ's birth. When we get to a Nietzschean critique, which I think implicitly is filtering into our political discourse with a lot of the rise of the new right. the idea of burn it all down, the idea of the system is totally broken, the idea that we need to introduce some chaos in here. Well, that separates this idea that history, that time, that the human world can be the locus in which the eternal is made concrete, in which it's made real to us. We're these strange beings that we exist in the material world, just like animals, and yet we have a consciousness of something that is beyond us. And Nietzsche wants to say that, well, no, if we're ordering ourselves towards something that is beyond us, then we're limiting ourselves as human beings. It's a little bit simplistic to draw a comparison between Nietzsche and Nazism, but there is at least a seed of Nietzsche in Nazism, in the idea that we can do something that has never been done before, that we don't really care about tradition. And in fact, the places that voted most heavily for Hitler were the places that were least Christian in the 1930s.
Sure. Well, it worries me too. Now, again, I apologize. I didn't warn you I'd bring up Joshua Mitchell, but you probably have heard of him anyways. He's a philosopher in the States. I believe he's at George Mason or Georgetown.
Georgetown, yeah.
He's at Georgetown. Okay. And his book, American Awakening, and he suggests that if we don't learn or figure out a way to deal with a social sense of guilt beyond the woke innocence signaling, he calls it identity politics, but innocence signaling that's going on, or instead of virtue signaling. He says if we don't have a better response to that than what's being given, people will tend to turn to a Nietzschean response, which would be to say, just get over your guilt. It's not real. I don't care about it. I'm just going to have will and go forward and, bulldoze ahead of you. And so that's why I'm a little worried that, to your point, we need to actually talk about these roots in a way that hopefully can appeal to a broad enough spectrum of the Canadian public that we don't have to continually revert back to a very thin liberalism, neutral proceduralism. Politics is just about who gets what, when, where, and how. And now I'm rambling, and I see you want to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've read Mitchell's book. I don't agree 100% with everything, but I think it is one of the most incisive analyses of our particular moment. And I think he's absolutely right that the religious impulse in the human heart doesn't go away, even if formal religion is in decline. And I think that's really what we've seen with our politics, with identity politics. The human soul is always looking for ultimate things. It's always looking to belong to something bigger than itself. And so as religion declines there, even as classical philosophy declines, even if we want to put this in sort of Plato's terms of participating in the eternal, the soul participating in something that is beyond itself, well, then we look for that in politics. But politics can never really give us absolution. We can say, okay, so I have this sense of a guilty conscience, which is always there in the human heart, and particularly in a secularized Christian realm. And so I'm going to transfer this sense of guilt to the nation.
Right.
We participated in colonialism. So therefore, we need to be constantly apologizing for this. There's never an absolution in politics because there's always going to be further effects of, whatever is the source of guilt that we have identified. And so I think the reaction that you're starting to get on the right to this sort of leftist religion is not to say, well, some people on the right are saying we need to return, not to a religious religion
Mm-hmm.
rather than having a secular religion. Others, and these are the dangerous ones in my view, are saying, well, the problem is religion. We need to get rid of religion altogether and move in this very Nietzschean kind of direction.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where the very hard edge comes on the new right, and there are all sorts of dangerous consequences that could follow from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always like to throw out a comment for my more libertarian-minded friends. Tom Sowell even has written about this, right? And he talks about cosmic justice and this sense that people have that, life is not fair and things need to be leveled or whatever. And so even the libertarian economists, mind you, I guess we could call them more conservative in many ways, touches on this. I wonder, we've mentioned the word progressive a couple times and progressivism, and mostly in connection with wokeism. I'm wondering whether you could help me out here. It seems like there's maybe a few kinds of progressive. There's the Woodrow Wilson progressive who says we need to run society with experts, so more of the managerialism kind of progressivism. And then there's the sort of modern social progressivism that says it's almost individual expressivism, where I need to express myself to be fully me, and now I need to use the power of the state to protect my ability to express myself. Do you see two different kinds of progressivism, or are you lumping them all into the same bucket?
Yeah, Shawn, that's a great question, and that's a nice distinction that you've drawn. And I would draw a distinction between those two. I would say the first one is not inherently anti-conservative, whereas the second one is. So what I mean by that is the idea of the rule of experts is not, I would say, inherently opposed to conservatism. It's not opposed to Grant's vision. It's not opposed to the way that Canadian conservatism viewed itself in the 19th century and maybe the early 20th century. I think the problem is that the expert class has become captured by precisely what Grant talked about, by this kind of technical education and by this kind of view of human flourishing as simply a kind of fairness that is separated from our tradition, that is separated from greatness, that is separated from pointing toward the eternal. So I think that is the problem with managerialism. The second kind, the individual expressivism, I would say this is inherently opposed to Grant's kind of conservatism, because it says that ultimate meaning is not found in a transcendent order that is ultimately beyond us. It's that ultimate meaning is found in ourselves alone. I think this really is the advent of Jean-Jacques Rousseau coming into our thought. Rousseau talks about how all we have to do is to look inside our own hearts, and that's where truth is to be found. Well, it's certainly true in the classical and Christian inheritance that the universal is found in the particular. So we can see traces of the eternal, of the universal in people around us. But the ultimate location, as Plato knew, the ultimate source of this is outside of ourselves. Whereas I think with individual expressivism, the source is found inside ourselves. And so then Rousseau is going to say, well, but what about those other people who think that what I've found in myself actually isn't the truth? I'm feeling alienated here because people aren't affirming what I found inside myself. Well, that's where the government has to come in and, in Rousseau's language, force you to be free. In other words, force the rest of us to endorse what you have seen in being authentic to yourself. And that is what is going to bring about true freedom. But if I don't want to enforce that, well, then I need to be re-educated.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, that's well said. Your comments reminded me of Carter Sneed's work. He's from University of Notre Dame, and he did some work looking at the various legislation, the rulings on life and death issues, abortion, transgenderism, euthanasia, all that sort of stuff. And he noted that all of the rulings presuppose human beings, or presuppose an anthropology of humans being solitary, atomized will plus expressive individualism. And he argues that it forgets about the fact that we also have bodies, and those bodies are vulnerable, they're finite, there's a finitude to our existence. And in light of what you just said about wokeism and expressing the people's selves, they see their body as a lump of plasticine. Like Mary Harrington often says, she's a writer in the UK. She talks about liberalism seeing humans as meat Legos, just simply interchangeable units within this great industrial machine. But then on the social side of things, that plays out as people saying, well, if that's the way you see me, my body is just a lump of plasticine that I can change willy-nilly as well. But sorry, I'm going off on a tangent. I don't know if that sparks anything for you.
No, that's quite all right. I mean, you probably see this better than most people as a physician. Yeah, I mean, you're dealing with this all the time. But I think, Grant would say that the modern technological approach, modern science, it kind of developed in the early 17th century with Francis Bacon. The scientific method tends to see us as just a clump of cells that does not have any kind of innate ordering. The scientific method has produced some dramatic discoveries by isolating cells, as it were, in a microscope, in a laboratory, isolating your variable. I mean, there's no question that gives us great knowledge about how the physical world works, but it can't really tell us why. You do an experiment in a lab, and it will tell you put in your input, and then there's kind of this black box, and then we see what the output is, and the output happens to be very regular and consistent. So modern science is very good at telling us that. It's not good at telling us how, and it's really bad. In fact, it refuses the question of why. And this is really what Grant was getting at. When we throw off the pre-modern inheritance, we throw off the idea that these constituent parts have an innate ordering that is beyond us, that we don't just get to take these parts and do with them what we like. Now, that doesn't mean that we aren't individual human beings, that we aren't particular, but there is something universal. This is why we can talk about the human being, that there is something common to us all, and that means that there is something given to us all. And that means that nature is not something that we get to give the purposes to. Nature gives the purposes to us. And if we come to understand what nature is and what supernature is, and we order ourselves to that, that is going to be the recipe for human flourishing.
Yeah. So just very briefly, your comment about pre-modern thoughts, and it reminded me of Michael Hanby's work and him saying that we're not allowed to ask profound questions. We've ruled any kind of metaphysical questions out of order in the modern era. You're not allowed to ask, well, what is a human? Why are we here? What should we do? Is there any purpose to our life? What comes after this? And yet that's what we're dancing around in this whole discussion, are those larger questions, which by definition have been ruled out of order. They're not supposed to be talked about. But I think society now is begging for that discussion. Certainly we see in the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, where he's speaking to larger themes of myth and spirit, more from a Jungian sense, but I think people still hunger to have those questions answered. And the post-war, very thin, liberal, neutral proceduralism really isn't doing it for many people in society. And there's no other institutions to fill those gaps left. But I was going to pivot to Hegel if you don't have a comment on that comment. But so one thing that you said in your lecture that I just loved, I think it's crucial that we understand this. And so I want you to unpack this for us. So you mentioned Hegel, and full disclosure, I find it brutal to read Hegel. I can hardly understand a few words on a page. I find him so hard to follow. Maybe if I could speak German, it would be better. But anyway, so Hegel, very famous philosopher. It seems like everybody likes to refer to Hegel. But you touched on this in that there are left Hegelians who really look at the process of history ending in a universal Marxist state. And Charles Taylor would be considered a left Hegelian, I think. And then there are right Hegelians, and an example of a right Hegelian might be Fukuyama, who talks about the end of history and the ultimate universal state being sort of an endpoint of history. Whereas George Grant would say he'd disagree with both of those. He'd say he's not a Hegelian at all. So I was wondering if you could correct the mistakes that I've just said right now and give us a proper understanding of Hegel and really why we need to understand this idea of history as being an inevitability and progress. It leads to progressivism. It leads to a whole bunch of ideas that I think are warping Canadian thought, and how George Grant offers, I think, a better alternative.
Yeah, well, I'll correct things, seeing as how we don't have any actual Hegel scholars on this podcast right now, because I am not a serious scholar of Hegel, but I'll try and say a little bit about that. I mean, I think you've sketched the terrain very well there. I think a lot of our politics today, our left-right politics, is versions of left Hegelianism versus right Hegelianism. And they are both ultimately progressive in the sense that history is moving on its own.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to claim to fully understand how the interplay of nature and history in Hegel. That's kind of beyond my pay grade. But Hegel certainly amplifies the role of history relative to nature. It's maybe a bit of a caricature, but I'm going to say that he reduces nature to history. And so in that sense, whichever way things are moving, well, that's the way it was meant to move. History is moving as kind of an independent agent. And so there's never anything in the past that we can really learn from that can correct where we are today. You study the past only to see how we got to the present. Now, which way is history moving? And Hegel scholars don't even agree on this. Even Hegel's own students didn't agree on this. Some said, it's moving toward progressivism. Some said it's moving toward kind of classical liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
I think the problem with both of these is that, in effect, it says that the way that history is moving us toward a better and better state, ultimately to the ideal state, to the universal and homogeneous state, is that you don't really have any individual nations if you have a universal and homogeneous state. Grant talked a lot about this, and he was horrified at this thought, because this is an elimination of particularity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, and maybe a Hegel scholar could correct me on this, but at the end of the day, it really seems to throw out the possibility of Canadianness. The possibility that Canada is a distinct refraction of the light of truth, and that other nations are distinct refractions. That there's a reason that France should stay French, that Germany should stay German, that Russia should stay Russian. That there's something distinctive about great French authors, about great German authors, Goethe, something distinctively Russian about Dostoevsky, and that we learn more about the universal through understanding particularity well. Again, we learn about what it means to be in family, in relation to parents, to siblings, through being part of a particular family.
Yeah. Yeah, brilliant answer. Jeremy, we could go on. And one thing that I always try to do towards the end of a podcast is to ask, what should listeners be thinking about that we haven't touched on?
Yeah. I guess there's a lot of different directions I could go here. So let me try and turn it a little bit practical. Canada is in a new situation today vis-a-vis the United States, and yet in a certain sense we're in an old situation. I think looking at Canadian history has a lot to tell us today, and for that reason Grant has a lot to tell us today, not just because Grant is part of Canadian history, but because Grant pointed toward our history, pointed toward our inheritance. So in Grant's own day, Grant was said very accurately to sort of catalyze a bit of a Canadian nationalist movement through Lament for a Nation. But this movement was largely a left-of-center movement. And Grant argued, when he looked at this movement, he said, this movement has misunderstood my book, and this movement is going to fail.
Interesting.
Well, I think that's incredibly timely today, because we're seeing a resurgence of Canadian nationalism, and certainly we're seeing an attempt at a liberal vision of that. And I think there are a lot of sort of middle-of-the-road Canadians that are responding to that. But I think Grant points out that kind of vision of Canada is not an enduring vision, because it does not at heart distinguish Canada in any meaningful way from the United States. In a certain kind of sense, the left of center vision of Canadian nationalism, and I'm painting with broad strokes here, so there are certainly exceptions here, but I think the general, let's say, kind of Trudeau approach is that Canada is so much better than the United States because instead of, the United States being 50-50 conservative liberal, in Canada, it's more like 70%, liberal and progressive, and 30% conservative. And so all of those, horrible, gun-toting religious people don't really have effective power in Canada. And this makes us so much better than those backwards people to the south. But there are U.S. states out there that have a 70-30 balance between progressives and liberals on the one hand and conservatives on the other hand. Say Washington State. So what then really distinguishes liberal Canadian nationalism from a belief in Washington State? This is where I think it's bound to fail, because in essence, that vision of Canadian nationalism distinguishes us from the United States only quantitatively, not qualitatively. It doesn't offer a fundamental distinction. And this is what I think Canadian conservatism can do. I think conservative parties around the world are recognizing the limits of right Hegelianism, are recognizing that conservatism can't really just be classical liberalism. And I think Trump's tariffs are only accelerating that kind of trend. In a certain sense, I think we as Canadians are a little bit late to that party, and maybe I should say as Canadian conservatives are a little bit late to that party. But thankfully, we have guides people like George Grant and the tradition that he's building on, who can give a positive sense of the content of what it means to be Canadian and what it means to be proud of being Canadian without always having to be anti-American.
Mm-hmm.
If we can understand better what the positive content is of what it means to be Canadian, then in fact we won't always have to be defining our identity in relation to America. That we can actually have an identity that is something more than not American.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when you're defining your identity completely in relation to someone else, then you don't really have an identity. And I think that's the Achilles heel of liberal Canadian nationalism. And I think Canadian conservatism can offer an authentic vision of Canadian nationalism. And I think that's what we need to talk about today.
Brilliant. That's a great way to end. Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's been fantastic. I appreciate you taking the time today. I do a terrible job of asking people to subscribe, so please subscribe on YouTube or wherever you're listening. It really makes a difference overall. And again, Professor Geddert, this was fantastic. I really appreciate this, and I hope you continue to give lectures on George Grant.
I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me on, Shawn. You're asking fantastic questions, and I hope more and more people will be asking these questions.
Brilliant. Thanks again.
Thank you.